just come in and have a seat. And I suppose you've already learned a little bit about our town. You've noticed the vegetation, how pretty the fields are. It's because of all the water that we have. We're so high up, and we get all that water from Mount Hermon. So much water comes to us. Almost 3/4 of the year we look at the glistening snow cap on the top of that mountain. You know, it's not just a mountain, it's a special place. I've been told that that's the mountain where Jesus went with his disciples, and that's where the transfiguration took place, when his garments changed to white as snow, and Elijah and Moses came and spoke to Jesus upon the mountain, and God spoke and said that Jesus was his beloved Son, and the disciples were to listen and obey what Jesus said. It's a special mountain, a sacred mountain. It gives us more than water. It reminds us, when we look at it, of Jesus. But it was not always that way. This land, this town of Caesarea Philippi, was named for Philip, the son of Herod the great builder. Philip was a great builder also. That's why our town is so well established. But he named it after Tiberius and himself, so that's why it's called Caesarea Philippi. But the town used to worship the Greek god Pan and the god of good fortune, and also the god Baal-gad, but not anymore. We're a hub of Christian activity. I can remember the first time I heard Jesus. I had to listen from afar off, but I could still hear his voice, and it rang clear to me and settled deep in my heart. He was talking about believing in God. He was talking about believing that God loved us so much that if we prayed and asked God for something and we believed it when we prayed it, that we should receive it right then when we prayed. And then whatever we said after that, we would have it. I'd never heard anything like that. And I began praying to God. I had a need. I had a great need. For 12 years, I had been ill. I had an issue of blood that would not stop. The old covenant said that I was unclean while I was bleeding from within. It said that I could not be with other people. It said that anything I touched was unclean. The pillow I rested upon became unclean. The bed I sat upon became unclean. Every door latch I reached to open became unclean. Every utensil I used in preparing and eating food became unclean. But not just for me, for anyone that touched what I had touched. They too were ceremonially unclean. Becoming clean again for the one who touched what I had touched was as simple as washing clothes, bathing, and waiting until evening to become clean once again. Or it could be as complicated as having another clean person come in with hyssop and a water blood solution that had been made from under the altar where the sacrifice was made. Ashes were taken and stirred with running water. The water had to be poured, running water. And that concoction was put together, and then hyssop was dipped in and sprinkled upon whatever was unclean. That had to be done on the third day by a clean person who would have to wash his clothes himself, be bathed, and wait till sundown to be clean again. And then he would have to return again on the seventh day and again sprinkle everything that was unclean on the third day. So the seventh day at sunset, then everyone would wash their clothes, bathe in water, and become clean once again. But for me, my flow of blood never abated, so I never could become clean. For 12 years, little by little, my life closed in on me. Living with someone made it impossible for them to remain ceremonially clean. I became a person of isolation. I became a person who, when going out into public, would have to holler before me. I'd have to yell, "Unclean, unclean," so people would know to stay away from my contagion. I went to the priests, who gave me the best of their concoctions. They had recipes to cure my malady. One recipe involved alum, rubber, garden crocuses, all mixed together in a stew of wine, which I had to ingest. When nothing came of that, I returned again, and I was given another concoction, again with wine and Persian onions. I was given another concoction for an ointment to be put on my body, a stinky salve. Many ointments and salves. I even wore a bag around my neck for 4 months that had the ashes of an ostrich's egg. It smelled terrible, but I wore it, and at the end of the 4 months, I still was no better. We have very few doctors in our area, but when one came through, I gave him my money, and he gave me more treatment, but nothing helped. Other doctors came until I had no more money to give them, till I had lost contact with my family, with my friends, with my community, with my church. I could not enter into worship unclean. I lost all I had, and in poverty I lived from the goodwill of others. So when Jesus had said, when you pray, believe that you receive, and you shall have whatsoever you say, it rose in my heart like a gift from God. If I could just but touch the hem of his garment, I would be healed. This man of God was a vessel of God. I had heard how he had touched the blind, and they saw again. How he had touched the mute, and they had spoken for the first time. How he had touched the deaf, and they could hear. How he had touched the lepers, and they were cleansed. And I knew if I could just touch the hem of his garment, I would be made well. I stayed close by, as close as I could, without breaking the law, being taken and stoned as a person who was unclean and not observing the law of removal from the people. For if I would enter in to the people, to the crowd, and make them unclean, they had every right to take me and stone me to death. So I stayed as closely as I could, and I continued to listen. For this man, Jesus, came with much words. He came with good news. And I was there at a distance looking as I saw the leader of the synagogue, Jairus. He came and he fell down at Jesus' feet. In the midst of all the people, he began begging Jesus to come to his home. He said his daughter, his little 12-year-old daughter, was so sick they thought she was going to die. But if Jesus could come and lay his hand upon her, he knew that she would live. Jesus lifted Jairus and said, "Take me to her." Oh, I ran on. I ran as fast as I could. Oh, it was so difficult, for I was so weak. I had been weak for so long. The strength had flowed out of my body, but it is as if my faith gave me strength to run on, and I ran to where I knew they would have to pass by, to a close place where I knew I could reach out and I could touch the hem of his garment and be made well. And so it was. As the crowd pressed in upon Jesus, he moved much more slowly than I. And so I was in position and I could hear the crowd coming, though I could not see them from where I was down on the ground, huddled in a corner. I could tell by the loudness of the voices that he was coming near. He was growing nearer, closer and closer. Everyone was crowding in upon him. And as I saw their feet go by, I saw the feet of Jesus, and I reached out to touch the hem of his garment, but only the fringe of his prayer shawl brushed across my hand. For just an instant I thought I had missed it, and then I discovered I was well. I was well. I had reached out to grab him, but all that had happened was a brush of the fringe of his prayer shawl, and I was healed. I stood to my feet, and the crowd that had been gathered around him and moving through the street with him had taken me up into them, and I was moving along with them. And suddenly Jesus stopped. He turned around and he said, "Who touched me?" Everyone looked puzzled. And his disciples said, "The crowd is around you." He said, "No, who touched my garment?" Jesus was told by Peter, "Now, Jesus, the people are crowding in upon you. They were touching your garment." Jesus said, "No, you do not understand. Someone touched me, and faith and virtue went out of me. I felt it. I couldn't hide myself. I had known what had happened to my body. I was well, better than I had been 12 years before. I came forward, I knelt before him, and I told him all that I had endured, all that I had longed for 12 years. I told him all that I had heard him preach and teach, and how I had prayed, and I had believed when I prayed that I had received, that I should have whatever I said. And I had said, if I but may touch the hem of his garment, I shall be healed. And in fact, the fringe of his prayer shawl, the prayer shawl that Moses had been told by God, the people should make fringe, the men should make fringe on their prayer shawl and on their garments. They should make tassels at the four corners of their garments. They should put one blue thread. We knew that blue thread to represent the Holy Spirit of God. And so in each of the four tassels and on the fringe were to remind the people of God. And I told Jesus how God had healed me through the touch of his garment. And Jesus said, "Oh, no, it was your faith that made you well." And he lifted me. And he called me daughter. And he said, "Daughter, go in peace and be healed of your infirmity." In front of the people in my town, my religious community, Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, he had declared me well. Jesus had called me daughter. Now I was part of a new family he was making, the family of God. I had been brought back into my religious community with one word from Jesus, the authority of Jesus. And oh, how I rejoiced, and the people who heard my story and heard of my miracle, they rejoiced also. But the moment was short-lived, because soon came someone with news, and they whispered to Jairus, "Do not trouble the master any longer, for your daughter is dead." Oh, hope sank. A heaviness went over the crowd. I had caused the death of a 12-year-old girl because I had selfishly interrupted Jesus on his mission. I had delayed him long enough that the child had died. How could I live with that? Jesus said, "No, no, only believe." He told the crowd not to follow him, for we had demonstrated our disbelief. And he took only with him Peter, James, and John, his closest disciples, and Jairus, the father of the little girl. And they came to the house where there was much weeping and wailing, for the child was dead. And Jesus said, "She's not dead, she just sleeps." And they laughed him to scorn. And he put them all out of the house. And he took with him the mother and father of the little girl, and Peter, James, and John. And he entered the little girl's bedchamber where she lay dead. He walked up to her. And by now, some of us who could not stay away from Jesus were able to see through the shutter door. And we could see him take his hand, put her limp, lifeless hand into his, and lift her to life again. And she rose up, she sat up, she stood up, she walked around the room. No one knew what to do. Jesus said, "Give her something to eat." Oh, how similar this little girl and my story were. For 12 years, she had lived a life that had ended. For 12 years, I had lived a life that ended. With the touch of Jesus, we were both given a new life. With the touch of Jesus, we embarked on a future. With the touch of Jesus, we knew that old things had passed away and all things had become new. How very similar we were, but how very different, for she had been part of a community of faith. I had been excluded from my community of faith. She had been part of a family. I had been excluded from my family. She had been a girl without words of faith, but I had been a woman who had discovered faith. So very different were our experiences, but so very much the same were our results. So it was that I continued to follow Jesus. And even on that day that I went to make sacrifice at the temple, and I took 2 turtle doves to Jerusalem that I could sacrifice for my sin and my uncleanness, so that I could be made well in the sight of God, totally, officially, ceremonially fulfilling all of the law of Leviticus. And while I was there, a very terrible thing happened. They took Jesus by night, and they took him to the priests, who condemned him for blasphemy. And the priests took Jesus to Pilate, the governor of Jerusalem. And Pilate was unable to let him go. The people continued to say to crucify Jesus, to crucify him. Pilate offered freedom to Jesus, but they refused. And so Jesus was whipped, he was flogged, a crown of thorns was put upon his head. He was presented to the people, and still they had no mercy upon him. Still they said, crucify him. So Pilate washed his hands of the issue and did as the people asked. And a cross was given to Jesus. He was to carry his own cross. He faltered and got up again and continued to carry it step by step. At one point, his face was covered in blood. His back had been ripped open by the beatings, and he fell to his knees. While upon his knees, I had compassion upon him, and I ran to him to wipe his face, for the blood was flowing in his eyes. And I took my cloth, and I wiped his face to wipe the blood. And the soldier beat him to his feet once again, and he carried the cross a few steps farther, and again he fell. The soldier took a man from the crowd. His name was Simon the Cyrene. He had been journeying on business. The soldier demanded that he carry the cross for Jesus. And so he did, and up the hill they went, and I continued with them. Oh, what a sorrowful, sorrowful day that was. And I heard a woman cry out, "Oh, how blessed was the woman who nursed you, Jesus." And he said, "No, blessed are those who enter the kingdom of God." And he pronounced that woe to those who are with child, woe to those on that day when the end comes. And he continued to go up the hill to Gethsemane, where they nailed him to the cross, where they put a sign above his head, King of the Jews. And so it was that he died upon that cross that day. And he was taken down, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the other Mary, went and saw where he was laid. And then we women went away, for it was the day of the preparation. And Jesus had not been given enough burial spices. There had not been enough for him, but just the bare minimum. We made more burial spices so that we could go anoint his body properly after the Sabbath. And it was on that day that we were preparing the burial spices before we went back to his tomb that I took out my cloth once again, and I realized that there was an image upon it. For when I had wiped the blood from the face of Jesus, his face had been transferred to my cloth. And so it is that I have the face of Jesus upon this cloth, that now people have come and touched a cloth to my cloth, and the face of Christ has appeared, for the holiness of God has been transferred from my cloth to other cloths. They call them Veronica's, for my name is Veronica. And as you saw when you came to my house, I have erected 2 statues, one on the right and one on the left of my door, one of me kneeling, being raised to life by Jesus, the other, his hand reaching down to lift me up. And even today, a woman or anyone with faith toward God through Christ Jesus is on a collision course with their miracle.